To set the stage for today's discussion, picking up on some of the themes we heard yesterday and earlier today, the world is truly at an inflection point where AI technology has advanced faster than the law. And as Rob Silvers and Ava Kiley just emphasized in the fireside chat, through the terrific work of organizations like OECD, the G20, UNESCO, and many others, our democratically aligned countries have reached some consensus on the ethical principles that we need for AI. But as we've also heard throughout this conference, a lot of hard work still lies ahead of us in terms of translating these ethical principles into laws, regulations, standards, policies, and practices that will enable our society to capitalize on AI's many benefits in a way that protects our democratic values, which is crucial. As we all know, policymakers and other stakeholders around the globe have been grappling with these efforts. And today we are going to be delving into some of the legal and policy developments, including the specifics of the EU AI Act, the EU Parliament's reaction to it, the work of the Council of Europe, and the UK initiatives. And to do this, we are really fortunate today to be joined by 4 esteemed panelists. We have Lord Tim Clement-Jones, a member of the UK House of Lords. We are rejoined by Ava Kiley of the European Parliament and Chair of STOA. We have Jan Kleisman representing the Council of Europe and Werner Steg representing the European Commission. So I thought to kick us off to level set, it would be really helpful if each of you could just explain the positions of your organization with respect to AI regulation. And I thought we ought to start off with Jan Kleisman of the Council of Europe, since the CAHI just wrapped up its meetings last week with its recommendation. And Jan, I'm hoping you could explain your organization's work and how that work differs from the work of the European Commission.
Thank you very much, Lee. Good afternoon, everyone, dear audience, dear panelists, and thank you very much, Nicholas, for this fantastic opportunity. What is the Council of Europe doing on AI and how does it differ from the European Commission work and other work? Perhaps let me say a few words about what we are doing and also who is actually doing it. First of all, what is being prepared? You mentioned CAHI. It just finished its work. What is CAHI? 2 years ago, the Council of Europe, which is an organization of 47 European countries, not to be confused with the European Union, based in Strasbourg, but geographically very large, much larger, started work on 2 questions. Should there be an international legal instrument? In other words, should there be a treaty on artificial intelligence? Is that necessary? And secondly, if the answer to that question was yes, what should be the elements, the ingredients of such a treaty? These were preliminary questions which we were given 2 years to answer. And the first reply came a year ago, namely the finding that yes, we need an international legal instrument, we need an international legal framework, in fact, a binding international legal framework, because although much regulation, international treaties, standards already apply to AI, there are also important gaps. So we then moved on to try and identify the elements for such an international binding treaty, in a way, the ingredients of the dish, and the understanding that the actual cooking of the dish, the negotiations on the treaty, would start in May 22. The committee that was set up to identify all this just finished its work, in fact, just a few days ago, and it came indeed to the conclusion that we need an international binding legal instrument, so we need a treaty. And what is it to do? It is to prevent and mitigate the risks emanating from application of certain AI systems to human rights, rule of law, and democracy. And it also established that the legal requirements that we should set in such a treaty should be proportionate to the risks, which should be appropriately assessed. And therefore, for instance, transparency requirements to all should apply to all AI applications in order to assess whether they do pose a risk. Why should the Council of Europe as a regional organization be doing this? We were set up in the aftermath of World War II to prevent similar horrors from occurring on the European continent. And we have done so in the Council of Europe through setting legal standards. So it's integration through legal cooperation, if you like. And In the course since 1949, when the Council of Europe was established, we have some 200 treaties. The best known in Europe is the European Convention on Human Rights, but we have some 200 others as well. A particular precedent for the work on AI is our work on data protection and cybercrime. 40 years ago, when hardly any country in the world had any data protection legislation, in fact, data protection was a term that was hardly known, the Council of Europe established the first treaty in the world on data protection, Convention 108. It is in many ways the mother, some would argue the grandmother, of the European Union's GDPR. And 20 years ago, the Council of Europe established the world's first treaty against cybercrime, the Budapest Convention. 2 weeks ago, we celebrated the 20th anniversary with some 120 countries being represented in Strasbourg, 66 of which are parties, and the others who are participating in the framework of the Budapest Convention. And I should add states from all 5 continents, including many from the global south. So on the issue of cybercrime, the Council of Europe has launched an initiative which has been joined afterwards successively by countries from all over the world in the fight against cybercrime, but fighting cybercrime whilst respecting human rights, rule of law, and democracy. And I think that is also what is needed on the as regards AI regulation. Of course, a regulation that should be proportionate to the risks, but that should guarantee respect for human rights, rule of law, and democracy. And as I said, we can afterwards go into the more detailed elements, but the set of crucial core principles have been established, and we hope that these will be discussed next year when formal negotiations start. And we hope that these negotiations will go speedily, because events in a number of countries have demonstrated in Europe and also elsewhere that the use of artificial intelligence, both by the private sector and also very much by governments, raises substantial issues of rule of law and human rights. And therefore, the sooner an internationally agreed framework is in place, the better it will be for citizens and companies alike. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Jan. And now I'm going to turn it over to Werner. We've heard a lot throughout this roundtable about the draft EU AI Act, but I'm hoping you can give us kind of a broader perspective of its scope and what the proposal is and how it proposes to define AI that would be regulated.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. It's quite difficult to do this in a few minutes. I'll do my best. First of all, probably I have to say that we are not against AI as a technology. That's not our policy. We are rather in favor of a human-centric use of that technology in the interest of our society. And I think that's quite important for our whole approach, that we really try to get it all if you want. Yeah, we want to maximize the use of AI, and we can have more effective health policies and green policies and better production processes if we use AI, and we want to harness this potential. But for that to happen, we need to address the downsides, and that is the trust element, of course. So the whole regulation tries to marry innovation with trust, if you want. And it's certainly not a contradiction, because we have been talking to so many also businesses, of course, that said, we want legal certainty. We cannot really invest in AI, in its development or use, if we cannot be sure that what we are doing is considered lawful and ethical, if you want. So that's the first observation. The second is that we are really trying to be risk-based, and that has mentioned repeatedly, of course. So we're not saying AI is dangerous or AI is bad or good. We are saying there are particular use cases of AI that we consider problematic, and therefore we address it in different ways. So that's a risk-based approach, where we're saying there are some that we simply consider not in tune with our values. We don't want, social scoring systems. We don't want manipulation of children. We don't want mass surveillance by law enforcement. So there are a couple of things where we say we just don't want this in Europe. Then there is those high risk cases where we say they are high risk because they may put our health or safety at risk when they're embedded in products, for instance. They may be high risk in terms of fundamental rights, of discrimination, of privacy. Examples were given also in the fireside talk just before this panel. Getting a job, getting a loan, or predictive policing, an example that Eva gave before. So there are certain use cases that are highly risky, so the risks need to be mitigated. Then there are some where we say transparency may be enough. If I'm talking to a bot, I would like to know that, but it's not super risky. But if I don't like talking with bots, then I then I stop doing so. So that's a risk-based approach. The flexibility is another one. And that brings me to this definitional issue, Lee, because of course, technology like AI is evolving as we speak. And if we define it too narrowly, too strictly today, it will be outdated by the time this law is adopted in Europe. So we had to find a way of making that more future-proof, where sort of the technologies used that may change very quickly can be adapted more easily in the future, whereas sort of what AI actually does, that is spelled out in law. So what an AI system in principle does. It's also flexible in a way that we said we focus on high risk use cases that we know today. So we're not trying to anticipate what may go wrong in the future, what it may be used for, but we have evidence that shows that there are situations whether AI is used by the public sector, law enforcement, immigration, asylum, deciding on social benefits, and so on and so forth, but also in the private sector, as I mentioned, in terms of education, vocational training, employment, but also this, of course, the area of biometrics, which is probably the one that has been debated most in the public since we launched the white paper. So we have those existing risky use cases that we're addressing here. If new problematic use cases pop up in the future, we will also have a more flexible way of adapting our law to those changing use cases. Then we're trying to be pragmatic. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We're trying to build on existing structures as much as we can. And that's very important, because you can come with a super advanced, sophisticated law, but then there's nobody out there that can implement or enforce it. So especially when it comes to safety related issues, we are using the existing structures where products already today are subject to third-party conformity assessment, for instance. We're saying, well, in the future, if such products entail an AI component that may put our health at risk, then that has to be assessed and validated in the same process. So it's pragmatic. Last but not least, of course, it needs to be effective as well. And these are the requirements themselves. So if anybody falls within those high-risk use cases, they then have to do all the checks in terms of data quality, which is the obvious one, of course. Also, whether the data has been lawfully procured, by the way, but also whether the quality of the data that feed the system are free of bias as much as possible, are representative, are relevant, and so on. Then the documentation is very important of the use of the AI system, so that there is a trace, if you want. So if there is any doubt as to whether the existing law is complied with, then law enforcement has a trace and can follow up on what that system did and on what basis. Then, of course, we have human oversight mentioned very often, but very, very importantly, of course, as well, the accuracy, the robustness, the cybersecurity of those systems. So if AI, for instance, is used by a doctor to identify cancer, diagnose cancer, of course, the doctor needs to know exactly what the system does and what it does not do, how reliable it is. Is it accurate in 9 out of 10 cases, which would be quite disappointing, by the way, or is it 99.9, which probably would even be not good enough. So these are a few of the core principles underpinning our approach. And probably with that, I leave it with my introductory remarks.
Okay, thank you, Werner. And that addresses one of the important questions that came up yesterday about building on the products liability regime, products approval regime in Europe. As we all know, the European Union legislation would need to be approved by the European Parliament. And we know that the European Parliament has also been looking at these issues, facial recognition, and through your digital committee. And Eva, we would be interested in your views in terms of how the Parliament views the draft act released by the Commission.
Thank you, Lee. Again, I'm happy to be co-speaker with excellent speakers and friends, Jan, Werner, and team again, and of course, Economo for making it happen. After Bernard, it's not very easy for me to add a lot of issues because it's just arriving at the parliament. So now we're going to see the debates and the contradictions that we need to, to discuss and decide our approach. But I could highlight a few points. Of course, the AI classification system is one of the things we're going to discuss. The EU bans, if it's going to be extended or reduced, for example, to the manipulation with subliminal techniques. We should perhaps define it better or decide how we want to approach that. For example, this could also match targeted advertisements. So we need to be careful. Then we have to decide again the model of the high risk. We've already talked about it, but it's really crucial to ensure that we talk about harmful AI. We should not create more friction. Everybody thinks that Europe is trying, to create friction after with regulation, and we don't allow innovation to happen. I think it's really critical to have such a model so that people will feel that they are safe and they understand that they have legal certainty also to deploy AI. So for businesses, it would be very important. The sectors that we consider we could identify this risk is transportation with autonomous vehicles, of course. A longer testing period and more safeguards would be essential. Education, manipulation of perceptions there, employment and credit scoring. There are, for example, cases where social scoring could lead to exclusion and not a clear understanding of results of artificial intelligence. And law enforcement, predictive policing or predictive justice could create extreme cases of inequalities or discrimination. So we definitely need to understand that in the justice system, AI should be complementary, and we still need to develop much more these technologies. I don't know if ever we should allow full control because we can include social metrics to the final result and the flexibility, but improve also the accuracy, but still humans are used to decide when we should give a second chance or when something should not proceed. I have the feeling that this would be very tough and very difficult to copy. Then the AI board, so if we're going to have like more authorities, again, because we need to have an environment where they will feel they have legal certainty, and it will be not a fragmented market, the European one, because this is a technology that should that it's beyond borders, and as we said before, it should have like-minded countries joining forces and not creating more barriers, digital barriers. Then I think it's interesting also to decide on the supervision, the enforcement, and the monitoring of these technologies, the liabilities. There are 2-3 files that will also complement the Artificial Intelligence Act, and they are really crucial for the final results. I can also add one thing that perhaps could be interesting, again, because Werner said basically everything. The biometrics, it's going to be, I think, a whole discussion around AI. But then we said that deep fakes should, we said that in 2019, there should be safeguards so that people will not understand, or will not be confused with the use of deep fakes, because some developers told us it's hard even for the developer to understand what is the real video or photo and what is real, what is fake. We have to ensure that people will not be confused, that AI will complement what we do, it will benefit society, and will not try to develop even conscious AI, so that we can have the transparency needed, not a black box of the outcome of even machine learning in artificial intelligence. So there are social, ethical, and liability issues that we need to discuss further. We are at the point where this approach of the Commission seems interesting, but again, I think we're gonna have to have extensive dialogues like the one that you are allowing us to have today here.
Great. Thank you so much, Ava. And that really does underscore the point that there still is a lot of hard work ahead in achieving these goals. I want to now bring Tim into the discussion because we know that the UK has also been looking at AI and recently released its AI strategy. Tim, if you could just give us a brief summary of the UK approach and perhaps compare and contrast that to the approach undertaken by the Council of Europe and the EU.
Well, Lee, thanks very much. And it's a huge pleasure to be back at the Athens round table, and also with such a great bunch of panelists too. And it's, good to be amongst friends. I'm speaking, as most people will know, as not as a member of government in the UK, but I think as an informed commentator. So you'll find that I'm not advocating, but more commenting on what the government is or is not planning to do. And I think we're rather faced with reading the tea leaves. This is rather like fortune telling at the moment, as far as trying to work out what our government is going to do with AI governance, because there are a number of conflicting messages which are coming across. On the one hand, I do think they accept the fact that we need to prepare for artificial general intelligence. That certainly is something which is explicit in the national AI strategy. In the strategy too, they talk about public trust and the need for trustworthy AI. They talk about government setting an example. They talk about the need for international standards. They talk about an ecosystem of AI assurance tools. And of course, they're going to, and they've said they're going to publish an AI governance white paper next year, early next year. And in fact, they've recently produced, as they promised to do, a set of transparency standards for the use of AI in the public sector, which I think have generally been welcomed, and they're fairly groundbreaking. On the other hand, there is this rhetoric about regulation being the enemy of innovation, which I think is worrying. And despite the very little appetite in business or the research communities, they're consulting on major changes to the GDPR post-Brexit. In particular, the suggestion that we might get rid of Article 22, which, we've heard from Rob about human in the loop, and we know how important potentially that is as a common factor in regulation. But, getting rid of Article 22 would be an extraordinarily radical step and would, I think, have an adverse impact on AI regulation. In fact, many of us would want to go further than Article 22 because it needs further clarification. And most recently, and Jan will know this, after 2 years of incredible work by KAHI, by the Ad Hoc Committee on AI in the Council of Europe, at the very 11th hour, and the 59th minute, the UK entered a reservation saying that they couldn't yet support the document, the elements of a legal framework on AI, on the basis that more gap analysis was needed. And of course, a huge amount of gap analysis has been done as part of the feasibility study for the KAHI feasibility study originally. So I was pretty baffled by that statement. And it's not even clear whether they've made a decision about whether to proceed with sectoral regulation rather than horizontal registration. They simply asked the question in the national AI strategy. And I think it's also highly significant that they've absolutely rigidly resisted regulation over live facial recognition technology in the police, for example, in the UK, despite law cases demonstrating that they're in breach of GDPR as a result. So it's a very confusing picture, especially given the work that the Turing have demonstrated their expertise in a number of different ways, but they've done a great deal of work on risk and impact assessment tools. They did the Hudaria work for the Council of Europe, excellent work. And they've contributed, the Office for AI and the CDI, Center for Data Ethics and Innovation, have made a great contribution to Council of Europe work and UNESCO work. So that all adds up to the fact that I can't predict what the white paper will say when it does emerge. But there is, I hope, recognition, and these are hopes, they're not predictions. I hope that there'll be a recognition that we need a considerable degree of convergence between ourselves, the EU, UNESCO, Council of Europe, particularly for the benefit of our developers, because we need, our developers will need, if you like, just as it does with the GDPR, we will need a common platform of ethics and regulation in order to be able to apply what they do develop across a wider group of countries than purely the UK. So a risk-based horizontal form of regulation, I am absolutely convinced is necessary, which operationalizes, to use that rather ugly verb, the common ethical values we all have. And, you know, we started with the OECD principles, and those have been put into effect in the EU AI Act, and the Council of Europe is by reference the European Human Rights Convention. You know, we know what the principles are. We now need to get on with regulation. And I'm pretty worried that if we're not careful, we're going to fall behind the pace. What we need to do in particular is agree on standards for risk and impact assessments, what the EU might call conformity assessments, and the tools for audit and continuous monitoring for higher risk applications. I think the agenda should be, you know, absolutely clear. In the US, you know, the National Institute for Standards and Technology is developing standards for risk assessment. So, I don't really see why there should be any resistance in the UK to doing that. But time will tell, and we'll see what happens in the spring when our AI governance white paper comes out. And of course, I haven't even touched on the defense area, which I know a number of members of our audience are very interested in, but that's for another day.
Great, thank you so much, Tim. And just to pick up on Rob Silver's comments, we have seen some activity in the United States as well. In addition to the points that Rob mentioned earlier this year, Congress passed the National Artificial Intelligence Act, which created an Office of AI within the White House. One of the noteworthy developments coming out of that initiative, which was also mentioned yesterday, is that the White House is looking at adopting an AI Bill of Rights, and picking up on some of the themes that we've heard from Ava and Tim and others. Looking at the use of biometric information is very much going to be a part of that effort. We've also heard from Senator Blumenthal yesterday that there are certainly people in Congress looking at legislation, although we haven't seen anything comparable in the US to what we were seeing before the EU. And then we're seeing agencies take some action as well. We heard about DHS from Rob, but we're seeing the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission in the US, ramp up efforts to look at AI, and other agencies as well. And then, of course, states within the US are doing that. So Tim's last comment, one of his last comments kind of tees up the next question. And we've heard throughout the conference the importance of achieving some level of global harmonization, because technology doesn't stop at borders. But we've also heard how the different governments and organizations are taking different approaches. I would be interested in each of your reactions to the other proposals that we've discussed today, and what you think is the best path forward for harmonization. And Jan, why don't I start this question with you?
Thank you very much, and many thanks to the other panelists for the very insightful comments. Perhaps a few words of what we're not doing at the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe is not about market issues. It's not about competition. It's not about the economic issues, strictly speaking. It's about the rights of citizens to be protected and the obligation of states to protect citizens. So that's very much the Council of Europe approach, which I think is very complementary to that of other organizations. And in fact, the committee that also Tim referred to, and I've spoken about, the CAHI, it meets in a composition which brings together 53 states, namely the 47 of the Council of Europe, our 5 observer states, the United States, Canada, Japan, Mexico, the Holy See, represented at very senior level. But it also brings together 28 companies, or associations of companies, including all US big tech, is at the table. And we have a host of civil society organizations, including the Future Society, which are also participating in the work. In addition, we have the European Commission, we have UNESCO and OECD. So we really try to be as embracing and to be as comprehensive as we can in the approach. We're not dealing with defense, so there I have to, like Tim, I have to disappoint those who are waiting perhaps for some comments on that. Because the Council of Europe statute excludes matters of national defense. However, we deal with everything else. Tim mentioned Udaria in the context of the Council of Europe's work and the Turing Institute. Just a quick explanation. Udaria is a model for human rights, democracy, and rule of law impact assessment, which Kai has also recommended that governments embrace before they deploy artificial intelligence. Let me then end by a few very concrete examples of what should be in, what we think is absolutely essential. We think there should be access to an effective remedy in cases, decisions taken by AI systems. There should be a right to meaningful human oversight, human review of decisions. And there should be an obligation of states to have that in place. States should also provide meaningful information to the citizen when states use artificial intelligence. So the citizen should know this and should have the possibility to request to be dealing with human agents. And there should be effective guarantees against arbitrary and abusive use. In addition, the question of sustainability, it hasn't been mentioned so often perhaps lately, although the decisions taken at COP26, the Glasgow Agreement, I think very much point in that direction. There was a very interesting panel there, for those who may have followed it, on the environmental impact of artificial intelligence. And in the human rights and democracy, rule of law impact assessment, I think it would be very good, and this is indeed also mentioned in our report, that sustainability and environmental impact would be assessed. So we're working very closely with other international organizations. Our approach is complementary in that it is human rights based and due process for governments based legal human rights and due process approach, complementary to the the guidelines that came out of UNESCO, to the guidelines that will come out of OECD, have come out already, and of course the AI work of the European Commission, which I understand, but of course stand to be corrected by Eva and Wenner, but is very much also internal market and product oriented. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Next, I'll turn it over to Eva. I know you and Rob were talking about different avenues for international coordination and hoping you might be able to elaborate on that a little bit.
Yes, so basically it's not easy to talk about like international collaboration when we have not yet decided how we can harmonize the EU. We have different national strategies already developed. What we're trying to do is to make sure we're gonna have a principle-based approach so that we make it more easy to create a layer of legal certainty for AI. And we are actually ambitious enough to say that we want to be global rule makers and rule setters. We achieved that with GDPR. Hopefully we will try to achieve the same positive impact with the AI Act and the Data Act. I understand, and we had this discussion actually, that we can collaborate with US. We would definitely agree on the same principles and some common standards. This is also part of an effort that has different organizations, different initiatives trying to work towards the same direction. What we need to do is also to find the core of this effort that could be accepted by non-like-minded countries. And that's why I think it's important to be flexible. It's important to have different layers of safety and obligations to make sure that we will not create, global banning situations or frictions with our regulation, but the opposite, we will release the dynamics of all these applications to make it more easy to comply with what we request. And in the digital economy, everybody might think that it's very easy. Everything we have, in the physical world, we can translate in the digital, but things change. So this translation has to happen with legislative initiatives in all the sectors. Or every sector of our life is being transformed. So we have to be very careful. Also, the challenges are different. There is a different virality in the real world and the online world, and there is a different harm that could be caused when we have a physical activity than an online activity. So this is a task we have to fulfill and complete, and we have to have constantly the international platforms and possibilities of collaboration in a dynamic dialogue. The other issue we have with this technology, to respond to your question, is that this is a technology that we still don't know its extent. We don't know its limits. We don't know how transformative it could be. So we need to have a more flexible approach to allow us with the developments to be able to come back and correct the mistakes that could happen. So to see how far it could go, where we should intervene. And this reminds me also that I was reading a book, that Thanks for Being Late, which matches very well what Europe is doing, not as an accusation, but as a strategy to not run faster than innovation, because innovation is to think out of the box. If we try to have always a box, it will be very difficult to be innovative, right? For people that they want to discover, different solutions and different ideas. So I think we will definitely need to update constantly what we will achieve at this point. And I'm happy that Jan, Werner, and team and this roundtable will be an annual possibility for us to exchange, knowledge, best practices, and also to understand the challenges and the risks. Definitely, when we talk about principles, though, we talk about the principles that we have in mind when Europeans talk to each other and when US and the EU is talking to each other, because democracy is a word that everybody can use, but the meaning that we give to it is the principles that come with also the geographical conditions.
Great, thank you, Eva. And now turning it over to Werner and hoping you can also address the how we achieve harmonization both within the EU and maybe address some of the European Council comments that came out about the EU AI Act last week, and then also, more broadly among democratically aligned countries.
Yeah, with pleasure. First of all, I just realized that I haven't downloaded your wonderful background of the Athens Roundtable, but at least you can see all the toys of my 4 kids. So you will believe me when I say that I don't want subliminal techniques to manipulate my children. Anyway, before turning to the global question, just to pick up on the last statement made by Jan, when you said that the EU framework is very much focused on internal market and products. That's only partially true. Of course, there's this product dimension that I mentioned, but the second pillar is all about the issues that you were referring to. It's all about fundamental rights, about discrimination, about privacy, all the examples that I gave from biometrics to education, vocational training, employment, law enforcement, asylum, use by judicial bodies, and so on. So it is definitely an important part of our proposal, as important as the product-related one. When we stress the internal market, that doesn't necessarily mean it's economic. It just means that we want the same rules to be applied in all 27 member states, rather than have a fragmented approach. Now, when it comes to Europe and the rest of the world, of course, for us, most importantly, we started with our own citizens. So if we feel that there is use cases or uses of AI that are detrimental to fundamental values, fundamental rights, health and safety of our citizens, then naturally we felt inclined to deal with it. And yeah, Europe has this tendency of regulation, but I would agree also with Tim that this is not necessarily a contradiction, or it's not contradictory to innovation, as I explained in my introductory statement. So we went it first. Not the first time, of course. I mean, GDPR was mentioned many times here, where also Europe came first and set a global standard. I think on platform regulation, we're doing something similar. And on AI, it's the same, but it's not because we want to be the world leader in regulation. We also want to be the world leader in AI, by the way, but it's just that we start with our own citizens. But that said, naturally, we want to liaise with the like-minded nations out there. And there are quite many of those across not just the US, but also beyond the US. But if you look into the US, there's this TTC going on, this Technology and Trade Council, where we're having these regular exchanges on digital policies. AI is one of the most prominently discussed issues there, simply because we are like-minded continents on this issue. We may not always have the same reflex in terms of legislation or the speed of legislation, but we definitely already agreed that we both sides care for trustworthy AI as a concept, for human-centric AI, that we both care for a risk-based approach, which we have discussed quite extensively already in this hour and before. And also the requirements themselves are widely shared on an international scale. When I spoke about data quality and documentation, transparency, explainability, human oversight, and so on, that also sort of what it takes to have trustworthy AI is also shared. And that brings me to one point that Tim made at the end of his intervention, when you spoke about the need for standards, develop standards for risk assessment, for conformity assessment, for audits. Well, that is what we have in common. If we all agree on the need to tackle high-risk AI cases, if we agree on the components of what makes AI trustworthy, then we can commonly discuss, well, how are we going to measure that? How are we going to assure that? How are we going to verify that? How are we going to audit that? So that is certainly an agenda that is open for any like-minded nation out there.
Thanks, Werner. Tim, what are your thoughts about achieving cross-border collaboration?
Well, I think this is such an interesting topic, and I'm going to pick up on what Werner said just now. But just before that, what we're doing in the UK is exactly the reverse of what Eva was describing. She was describing how you first establish your position and then you start talking internationally and going to various forums and expressing your opinion and so on, which seems to me to be the right way of doing it. But what we're doing, we're doing the reverse. We're taking part in GPay. We're taking part in the Council of Europe and issuing reservations. We're taking part in the OECD and UNESCO and so on, but without a fixed position, it seems to me. And this is one of the difficulties. So what I'm hoping is that this whole trustworthy AI agenda gradually closes in on the UK, where our developers are going to be saying, look, unless you come to a realization that we need a common platform for regulation, we need a common set of standards for risk assessment in the way that Werner described. And unless you have that, we are going to be prejudiced in Europe because rather like the GDPR being treated as the gold standard globally, the EU AI Act is going to be treated as the global gold standard for AI applications. And unless you do something to conform, doesn't have to be exact, but it has to be along the same lines where the same risk assessment standards, the same audit and monitoring standards are maintained, that you're going to prejudice our people. And you only have to look at the unicorns and so on and so forth in the UK. There's a lot at stake for our AI developers, and I hope that message will get through. I think the US, strangely enough, and it was a real tonic to hear what Rob Silvers had to say. I think strangely, the UK is particularly influenced by the US. Because they seem to think that, if they follow the US, that there won't be that much regulation and so on. But it sounds to me as though the US actually gradually is inching its way on competitive grounds towards greater regulation, which is quite interesting. I think where we will arrive at is a common set of standards for risk assessment and so on. I think the difficulty will be reaching where Jan is talking about in terms of remedies and specific areas where the human needs to be in the loop, and specific agreement on what particular elements are unacceptable in the way that the EU AI Act talks about a particular level of AI which is unacceptable. Now that I think is going to be quite difficult when push comes to shove, but we'll see. I think the reality will eventually dawn, but it may take some time.
Great, thanks, Tim. And now we want to hear from our audience. Katarina, can you please put up the poll question? Great. If the audience could respond on how important they think it is for us to achieve consensus on AI regulation. We're running short of time. We'll show those results soon. But in the meantime, I want to do kind of a quick couple rounds with each of our panelists. Picking up on something that Ava and Rob had discussed earlier, China. We all know China is taking a very different approach with respect to AI and moving forward very aggressively. How should regulators think about China as they form their regulatory agenda? Tim, why don't we start with you quickly on this round?
Well, essentially, I would following what I said earlier, which is I think once you've established, in a sense, a gold standard for regulation, it is very difficult to escape that. It's all very well to talk about, China. I mean, it's often raised in these debates that China will take an advantage in its development of AI because it doesn't have such strong regulation. I mean, interestingly enough, they did sign up to a set of Beijing principles based on the OECD principles. I'm not saying that they necessarily are going to go as far as regulation, but the truth is that a Chinese AI developer, if they want to apply their AI outside China, is going to have to conform to the regulations established by the Council of Europe, by the EU, by the US, by the UK. So this isn't just a free ride. And I think that in the same way that the UK will have to conform to a greater or lesser degree, China will have to do the same. And Chinese private companies developing AI applications already take a very strong interest in what is happening in regulatory terms. So, there may be security issues and so on, but at the end of the day, I wonder whether there are going to be the ethical issues that people think, or that China is going to outcompete us because, they have all this access to data without worrying about regulation and so on.
Great, thanks, Tim. Ava, what are your perspectives on China?
I mentioned before that one of the parts that we need to discuss is the social scoring. So this is something that we've seen happening in China. And we don't talk about governmental scoring. So I think we will have to have an extensive dialogue about what kind of scoring should be allowed and what that means, if you should be automatically excluded or fired in case you don't reach a certain scoring, if they should be allowed. It is known that China is the creator of this Black Mirror scoring situation for its citizens already. It's not science fiction, and it's using AI-powered mass surveillance. And they have been criticized for using facial recognition to surveil and oppress, also minorities, for instance, and now even at schools. So we know what we don't want to have with AI. We don't know what our future will not be in EU. If we can achieve something, is to ensure that we can keep discussing with China and ensure we can influence how they use AI for the benefit of also citizens. So Chinese companies that are not bound by substantial regulation that protects their citizens' personal data, and they are obliged even to have those data delivered to the government without any control of citizens, is the example to avoid for Europe. Therefore, authoritarian regimes, they have an advantage in developing AI models, which is something that could be used against the possibility that they have in EU, but this is a choice. We want to lead with quality, and this could be part of the leadership that we need to explain that we are seeking. And it is not acceptable for the ethical standards in general in the Western world. So I think the China actions will be also copied by other regimes, and it wouldn't actually advance innovation. I think in the long term, if you go in this direction, you cannot win the global tech race. And other countries don't even have the capacity that China has. So I understand that collaborating, as Tim mentioned, through the OECD countries and being able to lead deciding what are our principles, and then trying to influence also others through international organizations is a very smart way to go. But actually we have two parallel discussions. One is the main topics that we have agreed on, the main principles, but in parallel we're trying to see how others are developing their AI strategies, and we take that under consideration, since, as I said, it's going to be an ongoing process. So hopefully most of the world will not choose to follow the Chinese model, and we hope they will choose to follow the European model.
Great, thanks, Eva. I know we're running short of time, but Werner, what are your thoughts on China?
Well, I think we didn't set out to change what China does. We probably couldn't do that. We were looking first and foremost at what we ourselves need and want in terms of Europe, in terms of AI capabilities, but also the way in which AI is done. But that leads to the question of choice then as well, because by becoming stronger ourselves, which is part of our AI strategy, right? We talk a lot about regulation here, but we also have huge efforts to improve coordination of research across Europe, invest in AI. There's a lot of things going on in order to make Europe stronger, which would also mean, of course, larger access to AI systems that indeed meet our requirements and standards. And that brings me, of course, to the last point, and Tim, I think, alluded to that as well. If ever Chinese companies or any other third country wants to sell into Europe, they of course need to abide by our principles. And we come back to the single market notion that was mentioned by Jan. That means if you want to bring any AI technology on the European market, you need to abide by our regulation. So in that sense, it's not meant as protection. It applies, in an undiscriminated way to European companies, American companies, Chinese companies. But that's the beauty of having binding rules in place soon in Europe, because it's not just that we all say, yeah, we all agree to those principles. It is also that we can demonstrate, or companies have to demonstrate that those principles are complied with, and we have the means and tools to ensure enforcement of those rules if ever they are not complied with.
Great, thanks, Werner. And Jan, your thoughts?
Yes, very much in line with the previous speakers. Indeed, the gold standards, once they apply worldwide, will have to be taken into account also by those countries that may not have initially subscribed to them. Again, let me give our cybercrime convention as an example. 120 countries are participating in its framework. 66 have already ratified, 66 from 5 continents. And that has become a de facto and de jure, I would say, the global gold standard on fighting cybercrime. Very much hope that for artificial intelligence, the same will apply. Because several times Europe has been mentioned. For the Council of Europe, of course, Europe is not 27, but it's 47. And we also have very much, when we draft, and that I would like to underline as well, because US-Europe cooperation was mentioned. The United States is at the table at the Council of Europe, fully at the table. The Cybercrime Convention was very much co-drafted by the United States at the time. We hope the United States will be very actively engaged in our drafting and the negotiating process next year, as will be the governments of Japan, Mexico, and Canada. Israel, interestingly enough, has made a specific request to be admitted to the negotiations, and others may follow as well. So although it is under the aegis of the Council of Europe, we try to broaden already at the negotiating stage the partnership, and whatever comes out will be open for accession by non-member states on an equal basis. I think that's also important for the Council of Europe framework. It will be not something that an organization will impose on the rest of the world. Once other countries accede to the convention, the implementation the committee of the parties that will decide on further amendments, etc., will be composed of all those countries that have joined. So we hope it will really become a global standard.
Great, thanks, Jan. And Katarina, maybe you could show us the results for the first poll. Right, so it looks like an overwhelming majority thinks global harmonization is critically important and time is of the essence. We also want to hear from our audience on a second question. Katarina, could you put the second polling question up? So now that we've heard about different approaches to EU, to AI regulation, we'd be interested in the audience's thoughts on which one they think is best. And while the audience responds to that, I'm going to give each of our panelists a minute to share any kind of final thoughts or messages that they would like to impart with the audience. And Eva, why don't we start with you?
Well, I haven't seen much of the audience, but what I can tell you is that I've seen in the first actually Athens roundtable with Nicole as we were in Athens, that everybody started talking about AI with the word, I'm afraid that, I fear that, I will not have a freedom of choice, I'm afraid of something. So I really think that trustworthy AI is really essential, and with the prism of the pandemic, everybody now is hoping that AI will be a solution, a problem solver, even a vaccine. But in the end, we have to make sure that we will control autonomous systems that they use AI once they are embedded in hardware. So I hope we will manage to ensure trust to citizens to use AI systems. Whenever you use an application in Europe, you know that the government has done its standards, its work, so that you feel safe and that you have the legal certainty that you can enter and that you are protected. So we have to do the same for AI. So I see that the concerns are still high. So we need to make sure it's going to be transparent as much as possible. We will not have black boxes, and we will also solve the necessity of having a transparency for the deep learning, which is not easy. But I think since we are politicians, the metrics that will be chosen to be included in all the systems will also include social and ethical metrics. And we still have time. We don't need, to reach the perfect AI system. It's going to be as perfect as the creators of AI systems.
Thanks, Eva. Werner, your final thoughts?
But more an observation that I'm very happy with the level of debate that we're having right now, because it was only 2 years ago when this commission started out and we started to think about what to put in the white paper, in the consultation document, what are the issues, what are the risks. And 2 years later, we have such a high level of discussion and debate in Europe, but beyond, as witnessed in today's discussion, where there's such a basic understanding of what the issues are. There's also quite some consensus of what solutions may be, but most importantly, that we have a wide public debate about this in the first place. This is something that concerns each and every one of us. So I'm very pleased that each and every one of us seems to get involved gradually.
Great, thank you, Werner. Jan, your thoughts?
Yes, thank you very much. Very much agree with Werner. I think this discussion has shown that the degree of convergence between the different approaches and the complementarity, which I think is highly encouraging. I would also like to echo Eva's words. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We wouldn't have had a vaccine if it hadn't been for artificial intelligence. So it is a fantastic force for the good. It can bring real benefits, not only in the health field, but in many, many fields. However, like any other technology, it carries risks. And when it comes to risks concerning human rights, the rule of law, or the democratic process in our societies, I think it's important that there are safeguards. We feel there should be at least a minimum set of legal safeguards, binding safeguards on governments that contain obligations for governments to do certain things and refrain from doing other things, and real rights, enforceable rights with remedies for citizens. And we hope to achieve that, of course, in close cooperation with our different partner organizations, of course, the European Commission, OECD, UNESCO, and others.
Thank you, Jan. And Tim, your final thoughts?
Well, as ever, Jan has found the right noun for the description as to what should happen. I think 2022 needs to be the year of convergence, basically. What we need is all the institutions to basically move towards each other in the way they see AI regulation. As Eva and Jan said, I mean, AI has fantastic potential. We've seen, particularly in health, the great advances that are being made. But what we really need to do is to make sure that in whatever forum, UNESCO, Council of Europe, EU, OECD, US, UK, that we do converge on this risk-based form of regulation. And I entirely agree with Jan that what that needs to be is underpinned by basic safeguards. And if we can agree on that, it may not be every single bell and whistle on regulation that we agree on, but the fundamentals we really need to, because otherwise it's going to impede the development of AI for benevolent purposes. All the time, what we're trying to do is de-risk AI to make sure that the best form of AI is the one that is adopted. And if we do that, it can solve sustainable development goals. It can do all kinds of really exciting work.
Great, thanks, Tim. Very optimistic note to end on. And before we wrap up, if we could just see the second set of audience poll results. So it looks like, in terms of convergence, our audience is thinking, coming up with a compromise is the way to go. Anyway, this was a wonderful, wonderful discussion. And my sincere thanks to Eva, Werner, Jan, and Tim for their terrific inputs. And I will turn it back over to Nicholas.